I wasn't looking for evidence of pre-existing infrastructure beneath European train stations, but then I found the construction photographs. Photographs from the 1860s, standard documentation of railway expansion, the usual record of industrial progress. Workers posed beside excavation sites, engineers standing over foundation trenches, the kind of images that fill municipal archives across Europe without attracting particular attention. But one photograph preserved in a university collection in Vienna contained something I couldn't immediately place, a detail in the background that seemed innocuous until I began comparing it to other construction images, then another, then dozens more from the same period. At first glance, nothing seems out of place. Railway construction crews documented at work across Europe. Paris, Vienna, Budapest, St. Petersburg, the standard historical record of 19th century infrastructure development. Until you linger on certain details visible in the excavation sites themselves, details that repeat with disturbing consistency across completely separate projects, separated by thousands of miles with supposedly no coordination between construction firms. The tunnel entrances were identical. Not similar, identical. And this is the most peculiar part. These weren't the foundation trenches or utility passages you would expect from railway station construction. These were something else entirely. Openings that appear in the background of worksite photographs, visible beyond the official excavation areas, passages that show architectural characteristics inconsistent with 19th century construction methods. The further I went into construction archives, the more these pre-existing openings emerged. Not occasionally, not coincidentally, but systematically in excavation photographs from stations built during the exact same 20-year window. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be routine foundation work beneath a railway station. The photograph is dated 1863, the location identified only as Central Europe in the archive notes. Workers visible in the foreground, standard excavation equipment, nothing unusual about the documented construction activity itself. What's notable, however, is visible in the background of the frame. An opening in the excavation wall. Not a utility access, not a drainage passage, but an arched entrance showing stonework that predates the construction project by centuries. The arch itself displays construction techniques abandoned before the Industrial Revolution. Precisely fitted stones without mortar, load-bearing principles that suggest knowledge of engineering practices not documented in 19th century European building traditions. This prompts a straightforward yet vital question. How did passages built with pre-industrial techniques end up beneath sites selected for railway station construction in the 1860s? The sanctioned explanation falls apart at this point. We're told these were discovered accidentally during excavation. That construction crews occasionally encountered older structures, remnants of medieval infrastructure or forgotten cellars, random survivals from earlier periods of urban development. That any similarities across different sites are coincidental, the natural result of European cities building layer upon layer across centuries, but the photographs suggest otherwise. A surviving image from Paris shows excavation work for what would become one of the major railway terminals. The photograph is labeled 1867, filed without particular notation in railway company records. The image depicts the standard construction scene. Deep trenches, timber shoring, workers positioned at various depths in the excavation, but visible in the lower right quadrant of the frame is an entrance, not an opening created by the excavation, but a passage that was already there. The stonework around the entrance shows weathering patterns inconsistent with recent exposure. The architectural style doesn't match any documented Parisian construction from recorded periods, and the scale, the sheer size of the opening visible in the photograph, suggests something far more extensive than utility infrastructure. The pattern resurfaces with disturbing exactness in Vienna. Photographs from Stephansplatz station construction, dated between 1865 and 1869, show nearly identical circumstances. Workers excavating to foundation depth, encountering passages that shouldn't exist. The images document the same architectural signatures, the same vaulted construction, the same stonework precision, the same scale that exceeds any practical purpose for the structures being built above them. In Budapest, construction photographs from Keleti Station show what appears to be a ceremonial entrance discovered during foundation excavation. The image is dated 1871. The passage entrance displays geometric precision in its stonework, decorative elements that serve no structural function, and dimensions that suggest the tunnel beyond was designed for significant traffic. Not maintenance access, not utility infrastructure, but something built to accommodate regular movement of people or goods. Photographs from St. Petersburg document similar discoveries at multiple sites where railway infrastructure was being constructed during the same period. The images show passages intersecting with cathedral crypts built centuries earlier, tunnel systems that connect to ecclesiastical architecture through stonework that predates both the railway construction and, according to official architectural histories, the cathedrals themselves. One of many forgotten photographs, this one from a collection donated to a technical institute, shows a cross-section view of an excavation. The image quality is poor, the documentation sparse, but what's visible is undeniable. A tunnel, perhaps 12 feet in height, 8 feet in width, running perpendicular to the planned railway foundation. The construction technique visible in the photograph shows none of the characteristics of 19th century engineering. No brick, no cement, no iron reinforcement. Instead, precisely cut stone blocks fitted with such accuracy that the joints between them are barely visible, even in the photographic record. What's documented in engineering reports from the period is equally telling. References to pre-existing chambers requiring integration into foundation design. Mentions of unexpected structural elements necessitating design modifications. Budget line items for survey and documentation of discovered passages. The language is carefully vague, bureaucratically neutral, but the implications are clear. These passages were not only discovered, they were systematically encountered across multiple construction sites during the same narrow window of railway expansion. The measurements, when documentation exists, are remarkably consistent. Tunnels found at depths between 30 and 40 feet below street level. Passage heights between 10 and 15 feet. Widths between 8 and 12 feet. These aren't the dimensions of utility tunnels or drainage systems. These are the dimensions of passages built to move people. Between 1855 and 1875, railway construction in major European capitals proceeded at an unprecedented pace. Dozens of stations, hundreds of miles of track, massive excavation projects that required digging deeper into urban foundations than any previous construction had demanded. And across this 20-year window, across cities separated by vast distances, construction crews encountered the same thing, passages that were already there. The architectural evidence is what reveals the impossibility. In Paris, workers discovered passages connecting to Notre-Dame's crypt system. In Vienna, tunnels intersected with Stephansdom's underground chambers. In Budapest, passages linked to Matthias Church's foundation levels. These weren't isolated medieval remnants. These were systematic connections between ecclesiastical architecture and infrastructure that extended far beyond cathedral boundaries. The pattern emerges with mathematical precision when you map the discoveries. Not random encounters with old cellars or forgotten crypts, but consistent documentation of organized tunnel networks beneath structures that official history claims were built independently, centuries apart, with no coordinated planning. A photograph from 1869 shows what appears to be a surveying team inside a discovered passage. The men hold measuring equipment, their poses formal, suggesting official documentation rather than casual exploration. The passage walls visible behind them show the same stonework characteristics documented in other photographs, the same precision, the same scale, the same architectural approach that appears nowhere in 19th century engineering manuals, but shows up repeatedly in these excavation photographs from across Europe. This prompts another vital question. How did construction crews in separate cities, working for different railway companies under different national authorities, encounter architecturally identical passages during the same 2 decades? The photographs don't provide answers. They only document the impossibility. Tunnel systems that connect cathedrals to railway station sites before those stations existed. Passages built with techniques that predate their discovery by centuries. Architecture that suggests coordination on a scale that official history claims never occurred. The tunnels were already there. A surviving map from the time shows what appears to be standard urban planning. Railway routes through European capitals, station placements determined by practical considerations of geography and population density. The map is dated 1868, produced by an engineering firm whose records no longer exist. At first glance, the document shows nothing unusual. Lines marking proposed rail corridors, dots indicating station locations, the typical cartographic language of industrial expansion. Until you overlay this map with older city plans showing cathedral locations. Until you measure the distances, until you calculate the angles. The stations weren't placed for convenience, they were placed for access. In Paris, the distance from Notre-Dame to Gare de Lyon measures exactly 1,340 meters. The distance from Sacré-Cœur to Gare du Nord measures 1,290 meters. In Vienna, Stephansdom to Südbahnhof spans 1,380 meters. In Budapest, Matthias Church to Kaleti Station measures 1,310 meters. These aren't approximate proximities. These are precise intervals that repeat with mathematical consistency across cities that supposedly plan their railway infrastructure independently. The pattern deepens when you examine the geometric relationships. In several cities, major stations form triangular configurations with cathedral sites at specific angular relationships. Not approximate triangles, not general spatial arrangements, but geometric precision that approaches perfection. Equilateral triangles in some cases, isosceles patterns in others, but always with angular measurements that fall within a margin of error, smaller than 19th century surveying technology could reliably achieve above ground, much less in subsurface infrastructure planning. This prompts a straightforward yet vital question. How did railway planners in multiple European capitals position stations with geometric precision relative to cathedrals built centuries earlier, unless they knew about connecting passages beneath the surface? The sanctioned explanation gives way at this point. We're told station placements emerge from practical considerations: available land, property values, population distribution, topographical features, the standard factors of urban planning. But the mathematics don't support coincidence. The probability of these spatial relationships occurring naturally, without reference to pre-existing subsurface infrastructure, approaches zero. Not unlikely, impossible. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These are stories that require deep archival work, and your support makes this research possible. Engineering documents from the period contain telling references. A railway planning report from Vienna, dated 1864, mentions _quote _3 at the proposed Südbahnhof site. The report doesn't explain how planners knew about subsurface conditions before excavation began. A planning document from Paris references existing underground features that facilitate structural integration at multiple proposed station sites. Again, no explanation for how these features were known in advance. The further I dug into city planning archives, the more I found these oblique references. Not explicit mentions of pre-existing tunnels, but careful language suggesting prior knowledge of what lay beneath proposed construction sites. Survey reports that assume rather than discover favorable subsurface conditions. Engineering assessments that account for underground features before excavation reveals them. Budget projections that include line items for integration with existing infrastructure, without specifying what infrastructure already existed. Photographs from the period depicting what appear to be planning meetings show another pattern. Images from the era that show assembled officials, presumably municipal authorities and railway company representatives, examining maps and architectural drawings. One such photograph, preserved in a Berlin archive, is dated 1866. The men in the image are positioned around a large table covered with documents. What's visible, if you examine the photograph closely, are maps showing not just surface streets and proposed railway routes, but detailed underground features marked with annotations too small to read in the photographic record, but clear enough to confirm that subsurface infrastructure was being documented before construction began. A similar image from Budapest shows what might be described as a surveying team. The photograph is dated 1869, filed without context in a municipal engineering collection. The men hold instruments, their positions suggesting they're conducting measurements, but the location appears to be underground. Not a construction site, not an excavation in progress, but an existing space. A passage or chamber that predates the railway projects these men were presumably surveying for. Between 1855 and 1870, something changed in how European cities approached railway infrastructure planning. Earlier railway projects, those built in the 1840s and early 1850s, show straightforward engineering. routes determined by topography and land availability, stations placed where property could be acquired, construction proceeding with the standard assumption that builders would work with whatever ground conditions they encountered. But projects initiated after 1855 show a different pattern. Station sites selected with apparent foreknowledge of subsurface conditions. Route planning that accounts for underground features not yet excavated. Engineering proposals that reference integration with existing infrastructure. That official records claim didn't exist. The shift appears systematically across multiple capitals during the same narrow window. Not gradual evolution of engineering practices, not isolated innovations by particular firms, but coordinated change in approach across projects that supposedly had no connection to one another. What's documented in railway company correspondence is equally revealing. A letter from a Viennese railway official to a counterpart in Paris, dated 1867, references the protocols established for subsurface integration. The letter doesn't explain what protocols, who established them, or why such coordination between different national railway systems would be necessary. Another letter, this one from Budapest to Berlin, mentions quote _7 _ without identifying what survey or who conducted it. The pattern resurfaces with disturbing exactness when you examine construction timelines. In cities across Europe, railway stations positioned near major cathedrals began construction during remarkably synchronized periods. Paris initiated work on Gare de Lyon in 1847, but major excavation didn't begin until 1855. Vienna's Südbahnhof started planning in 1841, but deep foundation work didn't commence until 1858. Budapest's Kalidi station received approval in 1844, but excavation was delayed until 1871. In each case, the delays aren't explained by funding issues, property disputes, or political obstacles. The delays simply exist in the record. Unexplained gaps between authorization and execution. Then, between 1855 and 1875, excavation proceeds simultaneously across these cities. Not coincidentally simultaneous, but coordinated within windows of months, despite the projects being administered by different governments, different railway companies, different engineering firms. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a construction site. Photographs from the period depicting excavation work, though the specific location is unidentified in the archive notes. What's visible is a railway foundation under construction, but also visible in the background of the frame is an entrance to a passage that clearly predates the excavation. And standing near that entrance are men in formal attire, not construction workers but officials of some kind, examining what appears to be the passage opening. The photograph is undated, the figures unidentified, but the image suggests something beyond routine construction supervision. It suggests documentation of a discovery that was anticipated. The geographic precision of station-cathedral relationships extends beyond simple proximity. In several cities, when you map the tunnel systems documented in construction photographs, they don't just connect stations to cathedrals. They connect stations to cathedrals through routes that avoid natural obstacles railway planners supposedly couldn't have known about. Underground streams that would have complicated tunnel construction, bedrock formations that would have required extensive excavation, zones of unstable soil that would have necessitated expensive reinforcement. The passages documented in these photographs route around these obstacles with precision that suggests whoever built them had complete knowledge of subsurface geology across vast urban areas. This level of coordination, this degree of geographic and geological knowledge, shouldn't have been possible with 19th century technology. Survey methods of the period could map surface features with reasonable accuracy, but subsurface surveying, the kind that would reveal optimal routes for deep tunnels through complex geology, didn't exist in any reliable form. Yet the passages are there, documented in construction photographs showing engineering decisions that account for conditions the builders couldn't have surveyed. One of many forgotten photographs shows what might be a technical consultation. Several men, possibly engineers or architects, examining what appears to be architectural plans. The image is dated 1862, preserved in a French railway archive. The documents spread before these men show detail beyond what surface planning would require. Cross-sections suggesting knowledge of subsurface features, annotations marking connections between structures separated by significant distances. The level of detail visible in the photograph implies a degree of underground knowledge that official history claims wasn't available. The construction records themselves contain anomalies that point to prior knowledge. Excavation budgets that prove accurate to within small margins, suggesting planners knew exactly what subsurface conditions they would encounter. Equipment procurement that anticipates specific geological challenges before excavation reveals them. Labor estimates that account for working in existing passages rather than creating new excavations. The financial planning suggests certainty about conditions that should have been unknown. Between 1860 and 1870, railway construction budgets across multiple European capitals include nearly identical line items for what different companies called by different names, but all describing the same work. Integration with existing structures. Adaptation of discovered infrastructure. Incorporation of pre-existing passages. The language varies, but the budget percentages allocated to this work remain remarkably consistent. Between 12 and 15% of total construction costs across different cities, different companies, different projects, all setting aside the same proportion of funding for work involving infrastructure that officially didn't exist until construction accidentally discovered it. The mathematics are what reveal the coordination. When you calculate the probability of these spatial relationships occurring naturally, when you factor in the geometric precision, the synchronized timing, the consistent budgeting, the likelihood approaches zero. Not improbable, not unlikely, but statistically impossible. Without coordination based on shared knowledge of subsurface infrastructure. Photographs from the period depicting what appear to be completed stations show another pattern. Images from the era that show grand terminal buildings, architectural monuments to industrial progress, standard celebratory documentation of railway infrastructure completion. But these photographs, when examined closely, reveal details in the structures themselves. Basement levels that extend far deeper than necessary. Foundation walls that incorporate archways leading to spaces beyond the station boundaries. Architectural elements that make no functional sense for railway operations, but perfect sense as access points to pre-existing tunnel systems. A photograph from Vienna's Südbahnhof, dated 1873 and showing the completed terminal building, includes a view of the basement level. Visible in the background are arched openings in the foundation walls, passages leading away from the station proper. These aren't utility access points, they're finished passages, with architectural detailing inconsistent with railway infrastructure, but matching the stonework characteristics documented in excavation photographs from the construction phase. Similar features appear in photographs of other stations built during this period. Not crude openings or rough excavations, but finished architectural elements suggesting intentional integration with existing tunnel systems. The stations weren't simply built over discovered passages. They were designed to incorporate them, to provide access to them, to serve as nodes in a network that already existed. The station cathedral alignments are what caught my attention first, but the evidence becomes impossible to dismiss when you examine the timing. Across multiple cities, major cathedral renovations occurred during the same period as nearby railway station construction. Not coincidental timing. Not independent projects that happen to overlap, but coordinated work that suggests shared purpose. In Paris, Notre-Dame underwent significant foundation work between 1864 and 1869, precisely when Gare de Lyon was being constructed. In Vienna, Stephansdom received extensive crypt modifications between 1865 and 1870, overlapping with Südbahnhof construction. In Budapest, Matthias Church foundation work proceeded between 1871 and 1875. Concurrent with Colletti station excavation, the renovation work in each case involved deep excavation beneath cathedral structures. Work that official records attribute to structural stabilization or archaeological preservation, but that timing suggests had different purposes. Photographs from cathedral renovation projects show the same patterns visible in railway construction images. Discovery of passages predating the cathedrals themselves. Encounters with tunnel systems extending beyond church boundaries. Documentation of connections between cathedral crypts and infrastructure that reaches toward locations where railway stations would soon be built. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be renovation work beneath a cathedral. The photograph is possibly from Vienna, though the archive notation is unclear. Workers visible in the frame are positioned in what looks like a crypt space, but visible beyond them is an opening leading to a passage that clearly wasn't built as part of cathedral architecture. The stonework around this opening shows the same characteristics documented in railway excavation photographs, the same construction techniques, the same scale, the same age. The coordination wasn't just between railway companies. It was between railway projects and ecclesiastical authorities overseeing cathedral properties, projects that official records present as entirely separate undertakings, pursued for different purposes, administered by different organizations, occurring at the same time in multiple cities and revealing the same underground infrastructure. Between 1865 and 1875, cathedral renovation budgets across Europe included unusual expenditures. Line items for subsurface exploration, funding for documentation of discovered features, payments to engineering consultants who also worked on railway projects. The financial records suggest collaboration that official church and railway company histories never acknowledge. The evidence points to something far more expansive than coincidental urban development. The station cathedral alignments, the geometric precision, the synchronized timing, the coordinated renovation work, the shared consultants, the consistent budgeting. Not isolated patterns, but systematic coordination on a scale that requires pre-existing knowledge of an infrastructure network connecting ecclesiastical sites across Europe. They weren't building transit systems and renovating churches. They were building access points to something that already connected them. What's absent from the historical record is as telling as what's present. No contemporary accounts marvel at the discovery of extensive pre-existing tunnel networks. No newspaper reports express wonder at the archaeological implications. No academic papers analyze the engineering sophistication of passages predating their supposed discovery by centuries. The discoveries, if official history is to be believed, were routine construction encounters with old cellars or forgotten crypts, barely worth mentioning and certainly not deserving of systematic study. But the photographs tell a different story. They show deliberate documentation. They show official consultations. They show coordination between projects. They show knowledge that preceded discovery, and they show, in image after image, across multiple cities and construction sites, the same infrastructure being encountered, accessed, and integrated into 19th century building projects. The stations weren't placed where they were for the convenience of passengers. They were placed where they were for access to passages that connected cathedrals across distances that shouldn't have been possible to span with pre-industrial construction methods. Passages that suggested coordination on a civilizational scale. Passages that pointed to infrastructure predating the official historical timeline of European urban development. And when these passages were discovered, when their extent became clear, when their implications threatened to rewrite fundamental assumptions about European history, the response wasn't celebration of an archaeological discovery. The response was immediate, systematic concealment. Photographs from the period depicting what appear to be construction modifications. Images from the era that show workers sealing tunnel entrances with new masonry. One of many administrative photographs, this one possibly from a railway maintenance project, though the specific purpose is never explained in the archive notes. The image is dated 1872, the location unspecified beyond a designation of Central Europe. Workers positioned around an opening in foundation walls carrying materials, their poses suggesting active construction rather than routine maintenance. What's documented, however, is that the opening they're sealing shows stonework predating the foundation around it by centuries. This wasn't preservation, this was concealment. Between 1868 and 1877, something changed. The construction photographs stopped showing discovered passages, the engineering reports stopped mentioning pre-existing infrastructure. The budget line items for _13_ disappear from railway company accounts. Not gradually, not through natural evolution of project priorities, but abruptly, as if a decision had been made to stop acknowledging what excavation crews continued to encounter. The sealing operations are what reveal the coordination. Across Paris, across Vienna, across Budapest, across cities throughout Central Europe and into Russia, railway stations and cathedral sites underwent modifications during the exact same window. Not construction modifications, not expansion projects, but specific, targeted work that engineering reports describe as, quote, 14 or quote 15. But that photographs show a systematic sealing of passage entrances. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be foundation work at a railway station. The photograph is dated 1874, filed without particular notation in a municipal archive. What's visible is new masonry, distinctly Victorian in construction technique, built across what the photograph clearly shows was an arched passage entrance. Not repair work, not structural reinforcement, but deliberate blocking of access. The new masonry doesn't match the surrounding foundation. It doesn't integrate with the existing structure. It simply seals the opening. Brick and mortar applied in layers thick enough to ensure the passage beyond would be permanently inaccessible. The pattern appears systematically across railway and cathedral sites documented in construction photographs from this period. Entrances that were photographed as open in images from the 1860s appear sealed in photographs from the 1870s. Passages that engineering reports referenced as, quote, 16 in earlier documents are described as, quote, 17 in later reports. Access points that initial construction plans showed as incorporated into basement levels are absent from final architectural drawings. One of many forgotten photographs shows workers at what appears to be a cathedral renovation site. The image is dated 1873, preserved in an ecclesiastical archive with no explanation of the work being documented. Men visible in the frame are positioned in what looks like a crypt space, but they're not excavating or exploring. They're building walls, new masonry construction in a space that shows evidence of having been open previously. And what they're walling off, visible in the background of the frame, is an entrance to a passage that extends beyond the cathedral's documented foundation. The ceiling work wasn't presented as unusual. Engineering reports describe it in routine language: closure of unsafe passages, prevention of water infiltration, stabilization of foundation integrity. The bureaucratic terminology suggests ordinary construction work, practical measures to ensure structural soundness. But the photographs reveal something different. They show deliberate, systematic effort to block access to infrastructure that had been discovered, documented, and initially integrated into building plans. Between 1870 and 1875, railway construction budgets show significant increases in expenditures categorized as unexpected structural work or emergency foundation modifications. These line items appear across multiple railway companies in multiple cities during the same years. The costs are substantial, often representing 20 to 30% increases over initial construction budgets. Official explanations, when they exist, attribute these overruns to unanticipated geological conditions or structural challenges encountered during construction. But the timing, the consistency across different projects, the synchronized appearance of these expenses suggest coordination rather than coincidence. What the engineering reports don't explain is why passages that initial surveys had documented as stable, that early construction phases had successfully integrated into station designs, suddenly required sealing for structural safety. The reports reference concerns about collapse, about water damage, about foundation instability, but provide no technical analysis supporting these concerns. They simply assert the necessity of sealing work and document its completion. Photographs from Vienna show the progression. An early construction image dated 1868 shows a passage entrance incorporated into Südbahnhof's basement level. The entrance is finished with architectural detailing, suggesting it was intended as a permanent feature. A later photograph dated 1874 shows the same location with the entrance sealed. New masonry fills the archway, the architectural detailing covered over, the passage made inaccessible. No explanation appears in either photograph's documentation for why a finished architectural feature would be sealed 6 years after its completion. Similar progressions appear in photographs from other cities. Initial construction images showing passages integrated into building designs. Later images showing those same passages sealed. The modifications aren't subtle. They're obvious interventions, clear evidence of change priorities or change policies regarding access to these pre-existing tunnel systems. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a materials delivery at a construction site. Photographs from the period depicting routine supply operations, workers unloading carts. Standard documentation of construction logistics. The image is dated 1873, location unspecified in the archive. What's notable, however, is the quantity and type of materials visible in the photograph. Massive amounts of brick and cement, far more than typical construction or repair work would require. The volume suggests not ordinary maintenance, but extensive sealing operations, the kind of work necessary to block substantial passages rather than simply close small openings. The coordination becomes undeniable when you examine the timing across multiple sites. In Paris, major sealing operations at Gare de Lyon occurred between 1872 and 1874. In Vienna, Südbahnhof sealing work proceeded from 1873 to 1875. In Budapest, Keleti station modifications happened between 1875 and 1877. The work proceeded sequentially, each city completing its sealing operations before the next began major work. As if the same teams or the same coordinating authority moved from site to site, ensuring consistent implementation of sealing protocols. Engineering reports from the period reference consultations between cities. A Vienna railway document from 1873 mentions quote 23_A Budapest report from 1875 references quote 24 . The language is vague, bureaucratically neutral, but it documents coordination. It confirms that cities were sharing information about their sealing operations, ensuring consistent approaches across geographically separated projects. Between 1870 and 1880, cathedral renovation budgets show similar patterns, increased expenditures for quote 25 and quote 26 appearing across multiple cities during the same period. The timing of ecclesiastical sealing work parallels railway station modifications, when railway companies were sealing passage entrances in station basements. Cathedral authorities were sealing connections in church crypts, not coincidentally parallel but coordinated. As if the same policy directed both railway and ecclesiastical authorities to close access to the tunnel systems their construction and renovation projects had encountered. Photographs from cathedral sites document the same progression visible in railway images. Early renovation photographs showing open connections between cathedral crypts and extending passages. Later photographs showing those connections sealed. The modifications in ecclesiastical sites show the same characteristics as railway. Sealing work. The same construction techniques, the same materials, in some cases such obvious similarity that it suggests the same workers, the same engineering consultants, the same coordinating authority overseeing both railway and cathedral sealing operations. One of many forgotten photographs shows what might be described as an inspection. Several men in formal attire, possibly officials or administrators, positioned in what appears to be a basement or underground space. The photograph is undated, the location unidentified, but what's visible behind the men is new masonry sealing what was clearly a passage entrance. The men aren't workers, they're observers, their positions and attire suggesting they're there to verify or approve the sealing work. The photograph documents oversight, official confirmation that sealing operations were proceeding according to some established standard or directive. The evidence points to something far more expansive than routine construction modifications. The synchronized timing, the coordinated methodologies, the shared consultants, the parallel work in railway and ecclesiastical sites, the official correspondence confirming information sharing between cities. Not isolated construction decisions, but systematic implementation of a policy to seal access to pre-existing infrastructure across multiple European capitals. They weren't preventing structural collapse. They were preventing access to networks that connected these sites, that revealed coordination between railway and ecclesiastical infrastructure, that pointed to civilization-scale engineering predating official historical timelines. The sealing work coincided with another pattern. Between 1870 and 1880, archives across Europe experienced a series of what official records describe as unfortunate accidents. Fires in record storage facilities, water damage to document collections, administrative reorganizations that resulted in the misplacement or loss of construction documentation. Not everywhere, not all archives, but specific collections. Railway company records from the critical construction period, cathedral archives documenting renovation work, municipal engineering departments' construction files. The losses weren't comprehensive, but targeted, affecting documents from the exact period when passage discoveries and sealing operations occurred. A photograph from what appears to be an archive or records room shows the aftermath of a fire. The image is dated 1876. Location identified only as a railway company facility in Central Europe. Shelves of damaged documents visible, file cabinets with their contents destroyed. The photograph is cataloged as documenting a tragic accident, included in insurance records to verify the extent of loss. What's not explained is why the fire, according to damage patterns visible in the photograph, affected specific file sections while leaving adjacent areas relatively intact. Not the pattern of an accidental fire spreading naturally, but targeted destruction of specific document collections. Similar incidents appear in archives across multiple cities during the same decade. Not simultaneous, not obviously coordinated, but following a pattern. Vienna Railway Archives experienced _27_ in 1874 that destroyed construction records from the 1860s. Budapest municipal engineering files were _28_ in 1877, affecting documents from excavation and sealing work. Paris Cathedral archives suffered a fire in 1878 that specifically damaged renovation documentation from the preceding decade. Each incident, examined individually, appears as an unfortunate accident. Examined collectively, across multiple cities and institutions during the same narrow time frame, they suggest systematic elimination of documentation. What survives in these partially damaged collections is telling. Financial records often remain intact, showing what was spent but not what the expenditures funded. Correspondence referencing the work survives, but the technical reports those letters discuss are missing. Catalog systems listing document collections remain, but the collections themselves are absent. The pattern of survival and loss suggests selective preservation, ensuring that evidence of expenditures and work completion remains, while detailed documentation of what was discovered and sealed disappears. Engineering reports that do survive from this period show another pattern: revised editions of earlier documents, updated to remove references to discovered passages or integrated infrastructure. Initial reports that had mentioned _29 or _30 appear in later archives, with those sections removed or rephrased to reference only _31 or _32 without specifics. Not random editing, not natural revision of construction documents, but systematic removal of specific information from otherwise preserved records. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be an office or administrative space. The photograph is possibly from a railway company headquarters, dated 1878, preserved in a corporate archive. Men visible in the frame are positioned around desks covered with documents. What's notable is that this photograph appears in the same collection as other images showing archive damage. It documents intact records, orderly administration, business proceeding normally, but it's dated after the fire that destroyed construction documentation from the critical period. The photograph serves as evidence of institutional continuity, suggesting the document loss didn't affect operations, but it also confirms that some records survived while others, specifically technical construction records, were lost. Between 1875 and 1883, 17 major private library fires occurred in aristocratic estates across Central and Eastern Europe. The specific connection to railway and cathedral construction might seem tenuous, except these estates belonged to families whose members served on railway company boards, occupied positions in municipal planning authorities, or held ecclesiastical offices overseeing cathedral renovations. The libraries that burned contained, according to catalog records preserved in other collections, extensive technical and engineering documentation, including materials related to urban construction projects and historical architectural surveys. The sanctioned explanation falls apart at this point. 17 libraries belonging to connected families experiencing fires during an 8-year period, each fire destroying technical collections while leaving other materials relatively intact. Coinciding exactly with the period when construction documentation from railway and cathedral sites was disappearing from institutional archives. The mathematics of coincidence don't support natural occurrence. The pattern suggests coordination, systematic elimination of documentation from both institutional and private collections. What the insurance records show deepens the impossibility. These weren't general fires that consumed entire buildings. They were localized events affecting specific rooms, specific collections. Fires that somehow destroyed libraries while leaving adjacent spaces intact. Fires that were never fully investigated despite the immense value of what was lost. Claims were filed, compensation paid, and the losses documented as accidents without further examination of causes or circumstances. Photographs from several of these estates taken after the fires show the same pattern visible in institutional archive damage. Specific sections of libraries affected, other areas preserved. Not the random destruction of uncontrolled fire, but targeted elimination of particular collections. And in each case, what burned were technical documents, engineering reports, construction records, historical architectural surveys, exactly the materials that would document pre-existing infrastructure and its discovery during 19th century construction projects. The pattern of document destruction extended to personal papers. Between 1875 and 1885, engineering consultants who had worked on railway construction projects during the critical discovery period saw their personal archives suffer unusual losses. Some documented in obituary notices mentioning that personal papers were, quote, 33, quote, after death. Others referenced in legal proceedings where estate executors testified that certain documents had been burned, quote, 34, quote, the systematic destruction of personal engineering archives. The specific timing coinciding with institutional document losses suggests coordination, extending to individual consultants and their families. One of many forgotten photographs shows what appears to be a memorial or funeral. The image is dated 1881, archived in a municipal collection without identification of the deceased. What's visible in the background are mourners, formally dressed, their positions suggesting some official capacity. The memorial appears to be for someone of importance, possibly an engineer or administrator based on the attendee's apparent status. What's not documented is whether this funeral was for one of the consultants whose personal archives were subsequently destroyed, though the timing falls within the period when such destructions were systematically occurring. They weren't losing records through accident or natural causes. They were eliminating documentation systematically, ensuring that evidence of discovered passages, of coordinated sealing operations, of the infrastructure these construction projects had encountered would not survive in accessible archives. The evidence becomes impossible to dismiss when you examine what remains versus what's absent. Financial records showing massive expenditures survive. Correspondence referencing significant discoveries and important work exists. Catalog systems listing technical documentation remain intact. But the technical reports themselves, the engineering analyses, the detailed construction photographs, the survey data, the architectural drawings showing passages and their integration into building designs, these are missing. Not lost randomly, not damaged equally across all collections, but specifically targeted for removal from institutional and private archives during a coordinated elimination period. Archivists I've consulted when asked about these gaps provide the same responses. No records of removal, no documentation of destruction authorization, no explanation for systematic absence of materials that catalog systems indicate should exist. Just bureaucratic acknowledgement that the materials are gone, with no institutional memory of how or why they disappeared. The sealing operations are what revealed the coordination. The archive destruction is what revealed the intention. Not construction modifications to ensure structural integrity, not unfortunate accidents affecting random document collections, but systematic concealment implemented across multiple cities, multiple institutions, multiple collections, during the same narrow period when evidence of pre-existing infrastructure threatened to become part of the permanent historical record. A surviving print from the time shows what might be described as a planning meeting or consultation. Several men in formal attire, possibly architects or engineers, though their identities are not recorded. The photograph is one of several from a collection donated anonymously to a technical university archive decades ago. These men would have supervised the construction projects. They would have witnessed the discoveries. They would have directed the sealing operations. They left no accounts. Between 1855 and 1880, hundreds of engineers, architects, surveyors, and construction supervisors worked on railway station and cathedral renovation projects across Europe. These professionals documented everything. The 19th century was the great age of engineering documentation. when technical professionals published extensively, when professional societies maintained detailed records, when every significant project generated reports, studies, and analyses that entered the permanent technical literature. Except for this. Except for the discovered passages, not one published paper analyzes the pre-existing tunnel systems encountered during railway construction. Not one engineering society presentation discusses the architectural sophistication of passages predating their discovery by centuries. Not one technical journal article examines the implications of coordinated infrastructure connecting ecclesiastical and railway sites. The Haidu professional technical literature from this period, so comprehensive in documenting every other aspect of 19th century construction, contains no mention of discoveries that photographs prove occurred systematically across multiple cities. This prompts a straightforward yet vital question. How did the discovery of extensive pre-existing infrastructure beneath major European construction sites generate zero contemporary technical analysis? The silence extends to personal accounts. Engineers who spent years supervising these projects published memoirs detailing their careers, but never mentioning the passages. Architects who designed integration of discovered infrastructure into building plans left no letters, no diary entries, no personal papers referencing this work. Construction supervisors who witnessed excavation crews encountering pre-existing tunnels produced no accounts describing what they saw. Photographs from the period depicting what appear to be construction crews show the men who did the actual excavation work. Images from the era that show workers, presumably railway laborers, though their identities are often unspecified in the archives. One of many forgotten photographs shows a group of perhaps 15 men standing in front of excavation equipment. The image is dated 1869, location identified as a Central European Railway project. These men would have been the first to enter the discovered passages, the first to see their extent, the first to recognize their implications. They left no testimony. Employment records from railway companies document the workers assigned to specific projects. Pension files show where they worked, when they retired, sometimes where they died. But nowhere in these administrative records is there documentation of workers providing accounts of unusual discoveries, requesting explanations for sealing operations, or expressing curiosity about the infrastructure they encountered. The bureaucratic paper trail tracks their employment and compensation, but records none of their experiences. Between 1870 and 1890, labor movements across Europe were organizing, workers were forming unions, and working-class testimonials were entering the historical record in unprecedented numbers. Workers published accounts of industrial conditions, testified to investigating committees about workplace experiences, and increasingly participated in documenting their own history. Except for this. Workers who participated in discovery and sealing of pre-existing passages beneath European construction sites are absent from this expanding testimonial record. The pattern extends to workers who changed careers after these projects. Employment records show laborers who worked on railway construction during the critical period subsequently taking positions in other industries, other cities, other countries. Some emigrated, taking railway construction experience to projects in the Americas or British colonies. But in none of the testimonial accounts from emigrant workers, in none of the letters sent back to Europe, in none of the newspaper interviews with workers describing their experiences, is there mention of discovering pre-existing tunnels beneath European construction sites. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a workers' gathering, possibly a labor organizing meeting or social event. The photograph is dated 1875, preserved in a labor history archive. Men visible in the frame represent the kind of construction workers who would have participated in excavation projects during the critical period. These were the men who had organizational frameworks for collective testimony, who had emerging labor press for publishing their accounts, who had motivations to document extraordinary working conditions. Yet the labor press from this period, so comprehensive in documenting industrial experiences, contains no accounts of discovering ancient infrastructure beneath modern construction sites. The silence is most disturbing among engineers who should have been professionally obligated to document their findings. Engineering ethics of the period demanded careful documentation of construction conditions, especially discoveries that affected design or raised questions about site selection. Professional engineering societies maintain standards requiring members to contribute to collective technical knowledge. Failure to document significant findings would have been professional negligence. Yet the engineers who supervised these projects, who witnessed these discoveries, who directed integration and subsequent sealing of passage systems, produced no technical documentation for professional archives. Some engineers did publish during or after their involvement in these projects, but their publications address every aspect of railway construction, except the discovered passages. Detailed technical papers analyzing soil conditions, foundation engineering, structural loads, drainage systems, but nothing about pre-existing infrastructure. Professional presentations discussing railway station architecture, urban planning considerations, construction methodologies, but never mentioning passages that photographs prove were discovered and incorporated into building designs. Between 1860 and 1890, railway engineering became a prestigious profession. Engineers published extensively to establish reputations, advance careers, and contribute to rapidly developing technical fields. The absence of publications about discovered infrastructure is therefore especially notable. This was precisely the kind of extraordinary finding that would have established professional reputation, that would have contributed significantly to archaeological and historical knowledge, that would have been professionally rewarded through recognition and advancement. Yet not one engineer broke silence. Career patterns show another troubling pattern. Engineers who worked on projects during the critical discovery period often experienced abrupt career changes afterward. Transfers to remote colonial projects in Africa or Asia, sudden retirements despite being mid-career, shifts to administrative positions after years of field engineering work. The pattern appears too consistently to be coincidental. It suggests systematic removal of engineers with direct knowledge from European projects, geographic dispersion that would limit their ability to compare experiences or coordinate testimony. Pension records provide partial evidence. Railway companies granted unusually generous early retirement packages to certain engineers during the 1870s and 1880s. The recipients were engineers who had supervised construction during the discovery period. The pension arrangements were exceptional, offering compensation well above standard retirement benefits, but containing specific conditions whose details are often redacted in surviving records. The pattern suggests the pensions were inducements for silence rather than rewards for service. One of many forgotten photographs shows what might be an award ceremony or professional recognition event. The image is dated 1878, archived in an engineering society collection. Men in formal attire, medals or awards visible, suggesting professional honors. The photograph documents celebration of engineering achievement, but the archive notes don't specify what achievements were being recognized. These might have been engineers receiving recognition for railway projects, possibly including those who supervised construction during the critical period. But their achievements, as documented in the historical record, exclude mention of the most significant discoveries their projects encountered. Family archives occasionally preserve what professional collections don't: letters from engineers to relatives, private correspondence that never entered official records. I've tracked descendants of several engineers who worked on these projects, seeking access to personal papers that might have escaped systematic destruction. In most cases, the families have no papers from the relevant period. In several instances, families report that papers were deliberately destroyed by the engineers themselves, sometimes with specific instructions that certain documents be burned after death. An interview with a descendant of a Vienna railway engineer who supervised excavation work at Südbahnhof during the critical period revealed that the engineer had maintained technical notebooks throughout his career, except for a specific gap. Notebooks before 1865 survive in family possession. Notebooks after 1875 remain in the collection, but notebooks from 1865 to 1875, precisely covering the period when passages were discovered and sealed, are absent. The family has no explanation for the gap, no knowledge of what happened to those specific volumes. The pattern of selective documentation destruction appears across multiple engineering families. Personal archives that should contain materials from the critical period simply don't. Not because materials were lost accidentally, not because families didn't preserve papers, but because specific periods are systematically missing from otherwise comprehensive collections. The engineers themselves or their immediate heirs following instructions removed documentation from precisely the years when discoveries occurred. Between 1880 and 1910, as the engineers who had supervised these projects reached the end of their careers and lives, obituaries appeared in professional journals and newspapers. These obituaries typically provided comprehensive career summaries, listing major projects, highlighting significant achievements, establishing professional legacies. But obituaries for engineers who had worked on railway construction during the critical period show a pattern of omission. Their careers are documented comprehensively, except for the years between 1855 and 1880. Projects during that period are sometimes mentioned by name, but never with detail. Discoveries are never referenced. The most significant engineering experiences of their professional lives are absent from their official career summaries. The systematic silence extended to the next generation. Engineering education in the late 19th and early 20th centuries used case studies from recent projects to train new professionals. Railway station construction should have been prime teaching material. Technically complex projects in major cities that offered lessons in urban engineering, foundation work, integration of infrastructure with existing urban fabric. But engineering curricula from this period, while including railway projects generally, specifically exclude the stations built during the discovery period from case study analysis. Textbooks discuss railway engineering comprehensively but avoid detailed examination of projects that encountered pre-existing infrastructure. Construction workers who participated in these projects faced different pressures than professional engineers, but reached the same silence. Worker testimony that does survive from unrelated projects shows laborers were quite willing to discuss unusual working conditions, to report discoveries, to question instructions that seemed inexplicable. The absence of such testimony regarding passage discoveries suggests workers understood that certain experiences were not to be discussed. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a worker's rest break or mealtime. Photographs from the period depicting construction laborers, standard documentation of project activity. The men are positioned around what might be a work site, though the specific location is unidentified. These would be the men who physically dug into the discovered passages, who carried out sealing operations, who witnessed the most direct evidence of pre-existing infrastructure. Their silence is complete. The evidence points to something far more expansive than professional discretion or administrative confidentiality. The coordination of silence across professional engineers, construction workers, ecclesiastical authorities, municipal officials, across multiple cities and decades suggests systematic suppression, implemented through inducements, pressures, and dispersal strategies that ensured witnesses would never coordinate testimony or challenge official narratives about accidental discoveries and routine construction modifications. They weren't individually choosing silence. They were systematically prevented from speaking through career interruptions, geographic dispersion, financial inducements, and destruction of documentation that would have supported testimony had they attempted to provide it. But here's what haunts me. What were these passages actually for? Not utility tunnels. The scale is wrong. 12 feet high, 8 feet wide, extending for distances that photographs and construction reports document as spanning multiple kilometers between cathedral and railway sites. These aren't the dimensions of drainage systems or service passages. These are the dimensions of infrastructure built to move people, not medieval construction. The stonework is wrong. Precision cutting without mortar, load-bearing techniques that suggest engineering knowledge not documented in European architectural history from any period. The passages predate not just 19th century railway construction, but the cathedrals they connect to. Archaeological context. When construction crews documented the layers of earth and construction they excavated through to reach these passages, consistently shows the tunnel systems beneath everything else, beneath cathedral foundations, beneath medieval street levels, beneath Roman construction layers in cities with documented Roman history. The passages point to something older, something systematic, something that connected sites across continental distances before official history records the civilization capable of such coordination. Cathedral station alignments suggest this wasn't random infrastructure. The geometric precision, the consistent distances, the coordinated site selection that placed 19th century railway terminals in exact relationship to ecclesiastical architecture all point to prior knowledge. Knowledge that cathedrals had been built over nodes in a pre-existing network. Knowledge that enabled railway planners to position stations for optimal access to that network. Knowledge that someone retained across centuries, across the supposed collapse of whatever civilization built these passages, through periods when official history claims no such knowledge should have survived. The sealing operations reveal what this knowledge meant. When excavation crews discovered the extent of this network, when the implications became clear, when photographs documented infrastructure that challenged fundamental historical narratives, the response was immediate, coordinated, systematic concealment. Not archaeological preservation, not scholarly study, not public revelation, but elimination of access and documentation. The discoveries were dangerous specifically because they pointed to something official chronology couldn't accommodate: survival routes. The term appears nowhere in the documentation I've examined, but the passages themselves suggest the function. Infrastructure connecting major institutional sites across continental distances, scale sufficient to move significant populations. Architectural investment indicating long-term planning rather than emergency construction. These weren't simply transit tunnels. They were systematic evacuation infrastructure, built by a civilization that anticipated catastrophic need for coordinated population movement. What catastrophe were they preparing for? What knowledge prompted construction of continent-scale survival infrastructure? And what happened that made this network necessary to use and then necessary to forget? The evidence suggests the passages were used. Construction photographs occasionally show debris, material remains, traces of occupation in passages that had been sealed for unknown periods before 19th century discovery. Engineering reports, in the rare instances where such details survive, reference quote 35 or quote 36 without specifying what was cleared or removed. The passages had been occupied at some point between their construction and their 19th century rediscovery. By 1900, the sealing was complete. Passages that had been discovered, documented, and temporarily integrated into building designs were made inaccessible. Archives that had briefly contained evidence were purged. Witnesses who had seen the extent of the network were silenced through dispersion, inducements, or death. The generation that had direct knowledge was gone, and the generation that followed had only the carefully edited official record presenting routine construction projects that occasionally encountered old cellars or forgotten crypts. But the passages are still there. Beneath Paris, beneath Vienna, beneath Budapest, beneath every city where railway stations show the precise geometric relationships to cathedrals that couldn't occur naturally. Sealed behind Victorian masonry, behind foundations deliberately constructed to prevent rediscovery, behind sealing operations that photographs document as thorough and systematic, but not destroyed, sealed, not eliminated, and occasionally modern construction rediscovers them. Subway expansion projects that excavate deeper than 19th century foundations encounter Victorian sealing operations. Workers break through brick and cement barriers and find passages beyond. Passages that match the scale, the construction technique, the architectural signatures visible in 19th century photographs. And the response, in the rare instances where such rediscoveries become semi-public, remains the same. Immediate sealing, minimal documentation, no archaeological study, no public revelation. The suppression that began in the 1870s continues, updated for modern bureaucratic machinery but serving the same function. Contemporary construction workers, when they encounter these seals, are bound by the same silence as their 19th century predecessors. Non-disclosure agreements now serve the function that geographic dispersion and financial inducements served then. The legal framework changes, but the effect remains. Witnesses don't testify. Discoveries don't enter public record. The passages return to sealed obscurity, their existence denied or minimized by authorities whose institutional memory apparently spans back to the original suppression. I look at these photographs now. Construction sites from the 1860s and 1870s, workers posed beside excavations, engineers examining discovered passages, official documentation of access points that were briefly acknowledged before systematic concealment erased them from history. And I see evidence of civilization-scale infrastructure that connected ecclesiastical sites across Europe through underground networks built with engineering sophistication that predates documented European history. The photographs don't answer the fundamental questions. They don't explain who built this network, when it was constructed, why cathedral sites were positioned over access points, what catastrophe necessitated survival infrastructure on this scale, whether that catastrophe occurred and the passages served their purpose, or why rediscovery in the 19th century triggered such systematic suppression. They only document that the infrastructure exists, that it was discovered, that discovery was briefly acknowledged through integration into construction plans, and that acknowledgement was then systematically erased through coordinated sealing and documentation destruction across multiple European capitals during the 1870s. What else was sealed? The passages that photographs document represent access points discovered at construction sites, but those sites represent only a tiny fraction of potential network extent. If passages connect Paris to Vienna through cathedral and station sites, what lies between those documented nodes? How extensive is the infrastructure that 19th century construction never excavated deeply enough to encounter? And what knowledge did the passages contain beyond their architectural existence? The library fires are what suggest there was more. 17 aristocratic collections destroyed, containing what catalog records indicate were technical and historical documents. What did those documents reveal? What knowledge about the passages, about their construction, about their purpose, about their history, was so dangerous that it required destruction, even from private collections, whose owners had privileged access to information? Official archives didn't contain. And most troubling, did the suppression succeed? Or did knowledge survive in forms I haven't discovered yet, in archives I haven't accessed, in family collections that escaped destruction, in institutional records that weren't purged, in testimony that was recorded but hasn't been found? I'm still looking. The more I find, the less I understand. The more I document the suppression, the more obvious it becomes that something vast was discovered beneath European cities in the 19th century, something that revealed coordination across distances and timescales that official history claims impossible. Something that pointed to civilization-scale infrastructure serving purposes official narratives can't accommodate. Something that connected cathedrals to railway stations through passage systems built by unknown hands for unknown purposes. The archives hold no answers. Only more documentation of systematic concealment. Only more evidence that discovery occurred and was immediately suppressed. Only more fragments of a pattern that once connected the infrastructure of industrial Europe to something older, something that preceded official historical chronology, something that suggested survival preparation on a scale we're no longer permitted to remember. The passages remain, sealed beneath train stations and cathedrals, behind Victorian walls, built specifically to ensure we never access what lies beyond. The photographs remain, documenting brief moments when the passages were acknowledged before suppression made that acknowledgement impossible. And the questions remain, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, without access to what was sealed. What lies in those passages beyond the barriers? What waits in darkness beneath European cities? Infrastructure built for purposes we can only guess at, survival routes for catastrophes we no longer remember, connections between sites whose relationship official history claims never existed? I look at the construction photographs, at workers standing beside discoveries they weren't permitted to discuss, at engineers directing sealing of infrastructure they weren't allowed to analyze, at passages briefly visible before systematic concealment made them invisible again. And I see the loudest evidence of all. Not what the photographs show, but what the systematic suppression reveals. That something vast was discovered. That discovery threatened fundamental narratives. That suppression was coordinated across nations, institutions, and decades. That suppression continues. And that beneath our feet, sealed but not destroyed, waits infrastructure we're still not permitted to access. Connecting sites we're not allowed to understand as connected, serving purposes we're systematically prevented from discovering. The passages are there. The sealing is documented. The suppression is undeniable. And the silence, the carefully constructed absence of explanation, remains the loudest testimony that something extraordinary lies sealed beneath European train stations and cathedrals, waiting in darkness with whatever knowledge the Victorian walls were built to ensure we never find.